The letter arrived on a Tuesday, official HOA letterhead with that pretentious embossed logo they'd adopted last spring. I was enjoying my morning coffee on the back patio when I opened it, expecting another pointless reminder about lawn maintenance or garbage can protocol. Instead, I nearly choked on my coffee as I read the first paragraph. All homeowners with private access gates must provide a duplicate key to the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association by the end of the month. This non-negotiable security measure ensures emergency access. I stared at that paper, my hands shaking with a fury I hadn't felt since my last deployment. They wanted the keys to my gate, the one I'd installed with my own 2 hands on my property, that I'd bought with my military pension. The gate that protected the only peace I'd known since coming home. That's when I knew something deeply absurd was unfolding, and the ringleader's name, as I'd soon discover, was Douglas Winters, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood commander-in-chief. I'd served 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, building infrastructure in war zones that could withstand mortar attacks and vehicle bombs. Now they expected me to hand over access to my sanctuary? I set the letter down on my patio table and looked across my meticulously maintained yard to the cedar privacy fence and the custom iron gate I'd installed myself. That gate wasn't just a physical barrier, it was the threshold between the noise of the world and the quiet I'd fought to protect. Through that gate was my workshop, my garden, and the small memorial I'd built for friends who never made it home. I took a deep breath, finished my coffee, and did what any reasonable veteran would do. I headed straight to my workshop to draw up plans. Not for surrendering my keys, but for something much more permanent. If the HOA wanted to play hardball, they were about to learn they'd picked the wrong engineer to mess with. Living in Whispering Pines hadn't been my first choice. After retiring from the military 3 years ago, I'd searched for somewhere quiet, somewhere with space, somewhere I could finally let my guard down. My daughter had suggested this neighborhood, close enough that she could visit with the grandkids, but with enough land that I wouldn't feel suffocated. The 2-acre lots and mature trees had sold me on the place, along with the promise that the HOA was hands-off and just there to maintain property values. That might have been true under the previous board, but everything changed when Douglas Winters was elected president last year. He'd moved in from some planned community in Connecticut, where apparently every mailbox had to be the exact same shade of beige, and every Christmas light required committee approval. From day one, he treated the HOA like his personal fiefdom, introducing new rules every month and hiring compliance specialists to patrol the neighborhood. My property sat at the edge of the development, backing up to a protected woodland area. When I bought it, I'd specifically asked about restrictions on fencing and was assured I could build whatever I wanted as long as it was tasteful and didn't extend beyond my property line. The previous owners had a simple chain-link fence, which I immediately replaced with 6-foot cedar privacy panels. The crown jewel was the iron gate at the back, hand-forged by a buddy of mine who ran a metalworking shop. It featured an Army Corps of Engineers castle emblem and opened to a narrow trail that led into the woods. That gate was my escape hatch, a way to slip into nature without having to make small talk with neighbors or explain why loud noises still made me flinch. Behind that gate, I'd built a life that made sense to me. A small workshop where I crafted furniture from reclaimed wood, a vegetable garden that produced enough to share with my daughter's family, a stone fire pit where I sometimes sat until dawn, working through memories I couldn't share with anyone who hadn't been there. Now Douglas Winters wanted the key to all of that. I folded the letter and tucked it into my shirt pocket, then grabbed my phone and called Rick, my next-door neighbor and the only person on the street I actually spoke to regularly. Rick had been here longer than almost anyone else, 20 years, in the same house, and he knew the ins and outs of the HOA better than most. "They sent you one too, huh?" Rick said instead of hello when he picked up. "About the keys?" "Yeah, just got it. Is this even legal?" Rick sighed, and I could picture him shaking his head. "It's a gray area. The HOA has emergency access provisions in the bylaws, but historically that's meant they can call a locksmith if there's a gas leak or something. They've never demanded everyone's keys before. So why start now? Douglas claims there was a water main break on Sycamore Drive last month, and they couldn't access someone's backyard shutoff valve quickly enough. Cost the association a few thousand in damages to neighboring properties. I pinched the bridge of my nose, feeling a headache building. And that justifies keys to every gate in the neighborhood? According to Douglas, yes. He pushed it through with an emergency vote last week. Only 6 board members were present, and it passed 4-2. That doesn't sound right, I said, already mentally cataloging who I needed to talk to. What about you? Are you giving them your key? There was a pause on the line. I don't have a choice, James. My gate opens to the community pond. It's technically on HOA common property, even though it's attached to my fence. I thanked Rick for the information and ended the call, my mind already shifting into tactical planning mode. In Afghanistan, I'd learned that people who create arbitrary rules rarely expect resistance. They assume the weight of authority will be enough. But sometimes, standing your ground means being willing to outmaneuver bureaucrats who've never had their authority truly challenged. The next morning, I decided to go straight to the source. Douglas Winters lived in a sprawling colonial at the Eye. Entrance to the neighborhood, its pristine white exterior and perfectly trimmed boxwoods screaming, "I'm in charge here." I parked my truck at the curb and walked up the paved driveway, letter in hand. I'd barely knocked when the door swung open. Douglas stood there in a polo shirt with the Whispering Pines logo embroidered on the chest, khaki shorts pressed with military precision, and boat shoes without a scuff on them. His silver hair was cut in what my daughter would call an executive contour, and his smile looked practiced in a mirror. "James, what a pleasant surprise," he said with artificial warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "What can I do for you today?" I held up the letter. "I'm here about this key requirement." His smile tightened just a fraction. "Ah, yes, our new security protocol. Please tell me you're not here to complain. The board passed this measure for everyone's safety." "My gate is on my property," I said, keeping my voice level. "It doesn't access any common areas or utility connections. There's no reason for the HOA to have a key." Douglas's expression shifted to one of exaggerated patience, like he was explaining something simple to a child. "James, while I appreciate your independent spirit, the rules apply to everyone. We need access in case of emergencies. Surely, as a former military man, you understand the importance of security protocols." The way he said "former military man" made my jaw clench, like my 2 decades of service was just some quirky hobby I'd once had. I understand security better than most, Douglas. That's why I'm not handing over access to my property to someone who has no legitimate need for it. His smile disappeared entirely now. The bylaws give the HOA the right to implement emergency measures. This was properly voted on and approved by 4 people out of a 12-member board, from what I hear. Douglas's eyes narrowed. "You've been talking to Rick Tanner, I see. Well, I'm sorry you feel this way, but the deadline stands. Keys must be submitted by the end of the month or we'll be forced to issue fines, starting at $100 per day." I looked past him into the immaculate foyer, where a framed print of the HOA covenant hung like a sacred text. "I'll have my lawyer review the bylaws." "You do that," Douglas said, his tone shifting to dismissive. "But I should warn you, the association's legal counsel drafted this requirement specifically to withstand challenges. We've covered our bases." I nodded once. "We'll see about that. Have a good day, Douglas." As I turned to leave, he called after me. "The neighborhood appreciation breakfast is this Saturday. It would be good for community spirit if you attended. Show you're a team player." I didn't respond, just walked back to my truck with measured steps that I knew betrayed none of the anger boiling inside me. 22 years of military discipline had its uses, even in suburbia. That afternoon, I called 3 lawyers. The first two gave me variations of the same answer. Challenging the HOA would be expensive and time-consuming, with no guarantee of success. Courts tended to give homeowners associations broad latitude, and the emergency access provision in our bylaws was vaguely worded enough that it could cover this situation. The third lawyer, a woman named Michelle Patel who specialized in property disputes, was more encouraging but still cautious. "They're overreaching," she said after I explained the situation, "but not necessarily breaking the law. The question is whether this new rule represents a reasonable exercise of their authority. That's subjective enough that a judge could go either way. So, what are my options? You could file for an injunction to prevent them from implementing the rule while we challenge its validity. That would cost around $5,000 to start, with no guarantees. Or you could try to rally other homeowners and force a full board vote or bylaw amendment." I thanked her for her time and promised to think it over. $5,000 was a lot to gamble on a principle, even one I believed in strongly. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the neighborhood directory, a legal pad, and a determination to find another way. I started making calls to other homeowners, focusing on those I knew had backyard gates or who'd expressed frustration with Douglas's regime in the past. The responses were a mixed bag. Some people had already reluctantly turned in their keys, unwilling to rock the boat. Others shared my outrage but were afraid of becoming targets for Douglas's compliance specialists, who seemed to inspect the properties of known dissenters with extra scrutiny. A few promised to attend the next board meeting to voice concerns. By the time I finished my calls, I had a list of 7 homeowners willing to speak up and another dozen who supported resistance but wanted to remain anonymous. It wasn't enough to force a special vote, but it was something. I made another cup of coffee and walked out to my backyard workshop. The space was my sanctuary, a 20x30 timber frame structure I'd built myself, with windows salvaged from an old church and a wood stove that kept it cozy even in the dead of winter. Inside, the walls were lined with tools collected over decades, each with its own story and purpose. The workbench in the center held my current project, a cradle for my daughter's second child, due in 3 months. Behind the workshop stood my gate, simple but sturdy, with the castle emblem catching the last light of day. I ran my hand over the ironwork, feeling the cold metal warm slightly under my touch. Beyond the gate, the path disappeared into the woods, winding eventually to a small clearing with a view of the valley below. I'd spent countless evenings there, watching the sunset and finding a peace that had eluded me since returning from my last deployment. The thought of Douglas Winters or one of his cronies having access to this space made my skin crawl. It wasn't just about privacy or property rights, though those were important. It was about having one place in the world that was completely under my control, where the only rules were the ones I chose to follow. I walked back to the house and spread out a large sheet of graph paper on my drafting table. If lawyers and neighborhood politics wouldn't solve this problem, then maybe engineering would. I began sketching, first a top-down view of my property line, then detailed renderings of various barrier options. By midnight, I had the beginnings of a plan that made me smile for the first time since receiving that letter. Douglas Winters wanted my key. Instead, I was going to give him something much more substantial to worry about. The next morning, I made a trip to the county assessor's office to review the exact boundaries of my property. I needed to be precise for what I had in mind. The clerk, an older woman named Doris who'd worked there for decades, pulled up my parcel information on the computer. "Looking to put in a pool?" she asked conversationally as I studied the plat. "Map." "Something like that," I replied, noting with satisfaction that my property line extended a full 10 feet beyond where my current fence stood. The previous owner had built the fence well inside the boundary, probably to avoid having to trim the line of oak trees that marked the edge of the woods. "While I've got you," I said, "are there any county restrictions on fence or wall height in residential areas?" Doris adjusted her glasses and typed something into her computer. "Let's see. For your zoning district, structures under 6 feet don't require a permit. Anything over that needs approval, unless it's for agricultural purposes or specialized security needs. She looked up at me over her reading glasses. You planning something unusual, Mr. Rivera? I gave her my most reassuring smile. Just exploring my options, Doris. Thanks for your help. On my way home, I stopped at Burkhart Building Supply, the local contractor warehouse where I had an account from my workshop construction. Mike Burkhart himself was working the counter, a fourth-generation owner who knew every builder and project in the county. James, he called out when I walked in. What are you building now? That timber frame garage finally happening? I shook my head. Something different this time, Mike. I need prices on concrete blocks, the big ones. Mike raised an eyebrow. Retaining wall? Something like that. I'm thinking about the 2x6 solid blocks. How many could you get me, and how soon? He whistled low. Those are heavy-duty, man. You'd need equipment to place them. He tapped at his computer. I could get you maybe 30-40 from my regular supplier by next week. More than that, I'd have to reach out to some contacts in the city. I nodded, doing mental calculations. Let me know what your contacts say. I'm thinking I might need closer to 100. Mike's eyes widened slightly. That's some serious wall, James. Everything okay? I leaned on the counter and lowered my voice. Just having some disagreements with the HOA. Nothing to worry about. He nodded knowingly. Ah, Douglas and his rules. Say no more. My brother-in-law lives over in Whispering Pines. Says the guy's turned into a regular dictator. That's putting it mildly, I said. How soon can you get me a quote on those blocks? Give me till tomorrow. You want delivery, or will you pick them up? Delivery, I said without hesitation. And Mike? I'd appreciate if this stayed between us for now. He mimed, zipping his lips. What HOA doesn't know won't hurt him. I spent the rest of the day measuring and marking my property line, placing small survey flags every 10 feet. The work was methodical and oddly calming, reminding me of laying out defensive positions in the field. By sunset, I had a clear visual of exactly where my new barrier would stand, a full 8 feet beyond my current fence, reclaiming territory that had always been mine, but that I'd never fully utilized. That night, I received another email from the HOA, this one a reminder about the key submission deadline, with an attached form acknowledging receipt of keys that homeowners were expected to sign. The tone was bureaucratic and impersonal, but the threat was clear in the final paragraph. Failure to comply will result in enforcement actions as outlined in Section 7.3 of the Covenant. I printed the email and added it to a folder I'd started, labeled HOA Overreach. Then I went back to my drafting table and continued refining my plans. If Douglas Winters wanted to test my resolve, he was about to learn a lesson about unintended consequences. After all, I hadn't spent 2 decades building defensive structures in conflict zones just to surrender my home front without a fight. Saturday. Morning arrived with perfect blue skies and a neighborhood buzzing about the HOA appreciation breakfast. I skipped it, of course. Instead, I was in my workshop finalizing designs when my phone chimed with a text from Rick. Douglas asking where you are. Told him you had prior commitments. He doesn't look happy. I smiled at that. Let Douglas stew in his own self-importance. I had concrete walls to build. Mike Burkhart called just after noon with news that exceeded my expectations. Found you a source for those blocks, James. Demolition company just tore down an old factory downtown. They've got exactly what you need, and they're motivated to offload them. Price is about half what I quoted you yesterday. That's fantastic. When can they deliver? Monday morning work for you. They've got their own flatbed and forklift, I told him. Monday was perfect and transferred a deposit immediately. The timing couldn't have been better. Most of my neighbors would be at work, and Douglas spent Mondays at his real estate office in the city. That afternoon, Rick stopped by with a paper plate wrapped in foil. Brought you some breakfast. Figured. You might be hungry since you missed the neighborhood festivities. I invited him in and poured us both iced tea while he unwrapped blueberry muffins and bacon. So, what did I miss? I asked, though I wasn't particularly interested in Whispering Pine's social politics. Rick chuckled. Douglas gave a 20-minute speech about collective responsibility and community standards. Then he announced that 70% of homeowners have already turned in their gate keys. You think that's true? Rick shrugged. Doubt it. But enough people are complying that he's feeling confident. He hesitated, then added, He mentioned you specifically, you know. Not by name, but everyone knew who he meant. My grip tightened on my glass. What did he say? Something about certain residents with military mindsets needing to understand that we're not in a war zone anymore? Rick's expression darkened. It was out of line, James. Even people who usually support him were uncomfortable. The familiar heat of anger rose in my chest, but I forced myself to breathe through it. Getting emotional was exactly what Douglas wanted. Better to channel that energy into action. Thanks for letting me know, I said. And for the breakfast. After Rick left, I walked my property line again, this time with a can of bright orange spray paint, marking exactly where each concrete block would be placed. The new barrier would begin at the edge of my workshop and extend in an L shape along the rear and side property lines, enclosing the wooded area that contained my private trail. The existing fence and gate would remain for now, creating a buffer zone between the old boundary and the new one. Sunday morning, I received a hand-delivered note on HOA letterhead. The teenage messenger, Douglas's son, I realized, looked uncomfortable as he handed it to me and quickly retreated to his bike without making eye contact. The note was brief and to the point. This is a formal notice that you have 7 days remaining to comply with Emergency Measure 23-7 regarding access key submission. We notice you have been conducting survey activities on your property. Please be advised that any structural modifications require advance approval from the Architectural Review Committee. I folded the note and slipped it into my pocket. So Douglas had spies watching my property. That wasn't surprising, but it confirmed I needed to move quickly. I spent the rest of Sunday preparing the ground, using my compact tractor to clear and level the path where the blocks would sit. It was hard, sweaty work, but there was a satisfaction in it that reminded me of projects in the field, creating order from chaos, security from vulnerability. By sunset, I had a clean, level track of earth ready to receive its new burden. Monday dawned with a heavy mist hanging over the neighborhood, shrouding my property from curious eyes. Perfect conditions for what I had planned. The delivery truck arrived precisely at 8 a.m., the rumble of its diesel engine breaking the morning quiet. The driver, a weathered man named Earl, surveyed my prepared path with an appreciative eye. Military? He asked as we reviewed the delivery placement. I nodded. Thought so. My old man was Army Corps, too. Built bridges in Vietnam. He gestured to the blocks being offloaded. These came from the foundation of the old Westridge manufacturing plant. 60 years those blocks held up a 5-story factory. They'll outlast all of us. The unloading took nearly 3 hours. Each massive block was carefully positioned along my marked line, creating the foundation for what would become my new boundary. The concrete was weathered but sound, each block weighing close to a ton and standing 6 feet tall. Together, they formed an imposing gray line that already transformed the feel of my property. Just as the truck was pulling away, a silver Mercedes pulled up to the curb. Douglas Winters stepped out, dressed in a suit despite the humid morning, a tablet clutched in one hand. His face was locked in what I assumed was his sternest expression as he marched up my driveway. Mr. Rivera, he called out, not waiting to reach me before starting his speech. What exactly do you think you're doing? These structures were not approved by the committee. I wiped my hands on a rag and turned to face him calmly. Good morning to you too, Douglas. Don't good morning me. You're in direct violation of at least 3 covenant provisions. He raised his tablet, presumably to show me the relevant text, but I cut him off. Actually, I'm not. I checked the bylaws carefully. Temporary landscaping materials don't require advance approval. His face reddened. Temporary? Those are massive concrete blocks, which I'm using to establish a new hardscaping feature. The design is still in progress. Douglas stepped closer, looking past me at the row of blocks. This is clearly an attempt to build some sort of fortification. It's unsightly and aggressive. It's on my property, well within setback requirements, and doesn't violate any height restrictions. I kept my voice calm, matter of fact. Unless you can point to a specific bylaw that prohibits concrete as a landscaping material, there's nothing to discuss. He scrolled frantically through his tablet. Section 5.2 clearly states that all architectural and landscaping changes must maintain the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Aesthetic harmony is subjective, Douglas. I find industrial materials quite harmonious. His eyes narrowed. This is about the keys, isn't it? You're throwing a tantrum because you don't want to follow the rules like everyone else. The accusation hit a nerve, but I didn't let it show. This is about my property and my right to use it as I see fit within the legal boundaries of our agreement. Speaking of keys, you'll be getting my official response to that request by the deadline. Douglas's phone rang, and he checked it with obvious irritation. This isn't over, Rivera. The board will be discussing your landscaping at our emergency meeting tomorrow night? He turned to leave, then stopped. I've always respected your military service, but this kind of hostile, fortress mentality has no place in a peaceful community. I watched him drive away, his Mercedes accelerating faster than necessary down the quiet street. His parting comment lingered like a bad taste. The fortress mentality he mocked had kept my unit alive in places where the only rule was survival. But this wasn't about trauma or paranoia. It was about principle and the simple human right to determine who could access your own private space. The rest of Monday was a blur of physical labor. I rented a skid steer to help position the blocks more precisely, creating neat, tight rows with minimal gaps. Several neighbors drove by slowly, some stopping to watch with obvious curiosity. A few waved or called out questions, which I answered politely but vaguely. Just working on a new landscaping project, became my standard response. Around mid-afternoon, Elaine Chen from 2 doors down walked over with a thermos of iced tea. Unlike most of my neighbors, Elaine was someone I genuinely liked, a retired high school principal with no patience for bureaucratic nonsense. Quite the project you've got going, she observed, handing me the thermos. Douglas is having kittens about it, you know. He's been calling board members all day. I took a grateful sip of the tea. I figured he might. Elaine studied the blocks, with an appraising eye. Makes quite a statement. You planning to cover them with something eventually? Vines, maybe? Haven't decided yet. For now, I just want to reclaim my actual property line. She nodded thoughtfully. Well, I admire your directness. Most people just complain about Douglas behind his back. She gestured toward my existing fence. This is about the key thing, isn't it? Partially, I admitted. But it's bigger than that. It's about drawing clear boundaries. Elaine smiled. Literally, in this case. She turned to leave, then added, over her shoulder, for what it's worth, I haven't turned in my key either. Some things are worth standing up for. By nightfall, I had placed about 40 of the concrete blocks, enough to cover the border from my workshop to the midpoint of my back property line. The wall, because that's what it was becoming, despite my careful wording to Douglas, stood, solid and imposing in the twilight. I walked its length, feeling a sense of security I hadn't realized I'd been missing. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter. Dad, Mrs. Peterson from across the street just called Mom to ask if you're... Okay, says you're building some kind of compound back there. Should we be worried? I sighed and called her immediately, explaining the situation with the HOA and the keys. I downplayed the conflict with Douglas, knowing it would only worry her. Just setting some boundaries, honey. Nothing to worry about. Mom wants to know if this is like the time you built that rainwater collection system that violated city code and nearly got you fined. I laughed. My ex-wife had always been amused by my projects, even after our marriage ended. Less complicated? More obvious. But just as legal. After we hung up, I sat on my back porch watching fireflies rise above the new wall. Tomorrow would bring more work, more questions, and almost certainly more resistance from Douglas and his allies. But for tonight, I felt a peace that had been absent since that letter arrived. The wall was just beginning, but already it was serving its purpose, not just as a physical barrier, but as a statement, a line drawn literally in concrete. Douglas. Winters had miscalculated badly when he decided to demand my key. He thought he was dealing with a stubborn old veteran. What he didn't understand was that he was dealing with a man who had spent his entire career learning how to build things that couldn't be easily overcome. Tuesday morning arrived with an unexpected development: rain. Not just a light shower, but the kind of sustained downpour that turned dirt to mud and made construction work impossible. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching water cascade off my partially completed wall. The concrete blocks gleamed dark and imposing in the gray light, somehow more dramatic against the stormy backdrop. My phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line read, "Emergency Board Meeting. All residents invited." The body of the message explained that due to recent concerning developments regarding unauthorized structures, the Whispering Pines HOA would hold an open forum at 7 p.m. in the community center. Attendance was strongly encouraged for all homeowners who value neighborhood harmony. I forwarded the email to Michelle Patel, the property lawyer I'd consulted. Her response came back within the hour. "This looks like an intimidation tactic. They're hoping public pressure will make you back down. I'd recommend attending, but saying as little as possible. Don't give them ammunition." The rain continued throughout the day, keeping me confined to my workshop where I focused on finishing the cradle for my grandchild. The repetitive motions of sanding and fitting joints calmed my mind, helping me prepare for the evening's confrontation. By late afternoon, the storm had settled into a steady drizzle, and neighbors began emerging to assess any damage. Rick texted to confirm he'd pick me up for the meeting at 6:45. "Strength in numbers," he wrote, followed by a fist emoji that seemed oddly out of character for my mild-mannered neighbor. When his SUV pulled into my driveway that evening, I was surprised to see Elaine Chen already in the passenger seat. She rolled down her window and grinned at me. "Thought you might want some moral support from the resistance movement." The community center parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it, even during the annual 4th of July picnic. Residents huddled under umbrellas, hurrying toward the entrance where Douglas stood greeting people with what looked like a clipboard in hand. As we approached, I realized he was having everyone sign in, creating an official record of attendance. "James," he said with a tight smile as we reached the door. "So glad you could join us. Please sign here to document your participation." I glanced at the form, which included fine print about acknowledging receipt of verbal notices delivered at this meeting. Without taking the pen he offered, I asked, "Is signing in a requirement for attendance?" His smile faltered slightly. "It's standard procedure for all official HOA functions." "Is there a bylaw specifying that requirement?" Douglas's jaw tightened. "It's an administrative necessity, not a bylaw requirement." "Then I'll pass, thank you." I moved past him into the building, aware of the whispers that followed. The community center's main room had been arranged with rows of folding chairs, all facing a table where the board members sat like a panel of judges. A projector displayed a large image of the HOA logo on the wall behind them. Nearly every seat was filled, creating a buzz of conversation that died down as Douglas hurried to take his central position at the table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone who enjoyed public speaking. "As many of you know, Our community has recently faced challenges regarding compliance with our collectively agreed-upon standards. He clicked a remote, and the projected image changed to a photo of my property, specifically, my new concrete wall. The picture must have been taken that morning, as it showed the blocks gleaming in the rain. From the angle, it was clear someone had stepped onto my property to capture the image. This unauthorized structure was erected without proper approval, in direct violation of our covenant. Douglas paused for effect. While we respect every homeowner's right to improve their property, there are processes in place to ensure these improvements maintain the character and value of our neighborhood. Another click, another image. This one a close-up of the massive concrete blocks. These industrial barriers create a hostile visual environment and send a concerning message about our community's values. I felt eyes turning toward me but kept my expression neutral, remembering Michelle's advice to say as little as possible. Douglas continued through several more slides, each showing different angles of my wall, interspersed with sections of the HOA covenant highlighted in alarming red. His presentation was carefully crafted to make my project seem not just unsightly but threatening, a visual assault on community standards. And this, he said, clicking to a new slide that showed my property from a bird's-eye view, is what Mr. Rivera's landscaping project will look like when completed, based on the materials delivered and the pattern established so far. The image was clearly manipulated, showing a complete fortress-like perimeter with stark concrete walls towering over neighboring properties. Nothing like what I'd actually planned. That was the point where I decided I needed to speak up. I raised my hand, and Douglas pretended not to see it, rushing ahead with his presentation. The Architectural Review Committee has unanimously determined that— "Point of order," I said, loud enough to interrupt without shouting. Douglas paused, looking annoyed. "We haven't opened the floor for questions yet, Mr. Rivera. I'm not asking a question. I'm correcting false information being presented as fact. That last image is not an accurate representation of my project." A murmur went through the crowd. Douglas cleared his throat. "We've made a reasonable projection based on observable evidence. You've created a misleading image to frighten my neighbors." I stood up, addressing the room rather than just Douglas. The concrete blocks are being installed only along my actual property line, which is several feet beyond my current fence. They won't be higher than 6 feet, which is within county code. And they're replacing invasive privet that the previous owner allowed to overgrow. This wasn't entirely true. I hadn't planned to remove the privet, but it gave me an environmental justification that would be hard to argue against. Furthermore, I continued, I'd like to know who took these photographs, as they clearly trespassed on my property to do so. Douglas's face reddened. Our compliance specialists are authorized to document potential violations. Not by entering private property without permission, they're not. I remained standing, making sure my voice carried to every corner of the room. Now, would you like to explain to everyone why this emergency meeting was really called? Because it seems less about my wall and more about the key mandate that 28 homeowners have yet to comply with. The room erupted in whispers and side conversations. Douglas banged a gavel I hadn't noticed before, calling for order. This meeting is about covenant violations in general, Mr. Rivera. Your obstructionist attitude toward multiple HOA policies is simply the most visible example. Stephanie Morgan, the board secretary who I'd never actually spoken to, leaned forward to her microphone. I think we should clarify for everyone present. Is there a connection between the key requirement and Mr. Rivera's construction project? Douglas shot her a look that could have frozen lava. The issues are separate but reflect a similar disregard for community standards. I remained standing. Since we're all here, I'd like to understand the legal basis for demanding keys to privately installed gates on individually owned property. Has the HOA obtained an opinion from council regarding potential liability if those keys are misused? Douglas raised his gavel again, but Stephanie spoke first. That's actually a question several board members have raised, The emergency access requirement was passed without our standard legal review. An older man sitting toward the front raised his hand. I'd like to know who exactly would have these keys. Is it just board members or those compliance specialists, too? The meeting was slipping out of Douglas's control, exactly as I'd hoped. Questions began coming from all directions now. Who would be responsible if something was damaged during an emergency entry? What constituted an emergency? How would homeowners know if their property had been accessed? Douglas's attempts to redirect. Attention to my wall fell increasingly flat as more residents voiced concerns about the key policy. Even some board members began distancing themselves from the decision, suggesting it had been rushed through without proper consideration. After nearly an hour of increasingly heated discussion, Stephanie called for a procedural motion to suspend the key requirement pending further legal review. The vote passed 5-2, with only Douglas and his friend Gerald voting against it. As the meeting broke up, several neighbors approached me with questions about my wall project. I explained my actual plans, a partial boundary delineation, not the fortress Douglas had portrayed, and invited them to visit once the work was complete. Most seemed satisfied, though a few remained skeptical. Elaine caught up with me as Rick and I were heading to the parking lot. That went better than expected, she said. Though I suspect Douglas isn't finished with you yet. She was right. As we reached Rick's SUV, Douglas emerged from the community center, walking directly toward us with Gerald and another board member in tow. This isn't over, Rivera, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. The board may have temporarily suspended the key requirement, but your wall still violates Section 5.2 regarding aesthetic harmony. I turned to face him fully. The wall is being installed on my surveyed property line, using materials that are neither prohibited nor restricted by any specific bylaw. If you want to challenge it, you'll need to specify exactly which provision it violates. Gerald stepped forward, consulting a tablet. Section 5.2.3 states that all landscape features visible from common areas or neighboring properties must contribute positively to the visual cohesion of the neighborhood. And who determines what contributes positively? I asked. Because I can show you plenty of examples of concrete used in landscaping that are considered high-end design features. Douglas's expression hardened. The Architectural Review Committee makes that determination, and they've already found your project non-compliant. Without a site visit or any communication with me, that sounds like a due process violation. I kept my tone conversational, aware that other residents were lingering nearby, listening. I'd be happy to submit a formal application with detailed plans if that would resolve the issue. The time for that was before you started construction, Douglas snapped. Actually, Elaine interjected, Section 8.7 of the bylaws specifically allows for retroactive approval of projects begun in good faith. I served on the board for 6 years, Douglas. I remember when we added that provision. Douglas looked like he wanted to argue further, but seemed to realize he was losing ground with every exchange. With a curt nod, he said, "Submit your application. By Friday. The committee will review it at their next meeting." He turned and walked away, Gerald hurrying to keep up. The drive home was quiet, all three of us processing the evening's events. When Rick pulled into my driveway, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know he's going to make sure your application is rejected, right?" I nodded. "I'm counting on it." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "You have another plan?" "Always have. Contingencies. First rule of engineering." I thanked them both for their support and headed inside, already mentally drafting the application that I knew would never be approved. The rain had stopped completely by Wednesday morning, leaving behind clear skies and a soggy landscape. I was out early checking my property for storm damage when I noticed a county vehicle parked at the curb. A man in a khaki uniform was taking photographs of my wall from the street. I approached him, coffee mug still in hand. "Good morning. Can I help you with something?" He turned, looking slightly embarrassed at being observed. Mr. Rivera? I'm Carl Wilson from the County Code Enforcement Office. We received a complaint about a structure on your property potentially violating height restrictions. Of course, Douglas had called the county. It was the obvious next move. I'd be happy to show you what I'm working on, I said, gesturing for him to follow me around the side of the house. Carl walked the length of my partially completed wall, measuring its height at several points and checking his notes. 6 feet exactly, he confirmed. That's within residential code for fencing and decorative barriers. And it's entirely within my property boundaries, I added, showing him the survey markers I'd placed. He made a few notes on his tablet. Technically, you should have obtained a permit for a structure of this scale, but since it's under the height threshold, it falls into a gray area. He looked up at me. I'll need to file a report, but I don't see any actionable violations here. I'd appreciate a copy of that report if possible, I said. Carl nodded. Sure thing. Might take a few days to process. He hesitated, then added, Get a lot of complaints from this neighborhood. HOA president seems to have the Code Enforcement Office on speed dial. After he left, I called Mike Burkhart to schedule delivery of the remaining concrete blocks. The rain had set me back a day, but with good weather forecasted, I could make significant progress before the weekend. Thursday's delivery arrived as scheduled, bringing another 60 concrete blocks that we carefully positioned along my marked line without permanently installing them, a distinction that basically meant I didn't use mortar or connect them with rebar as originally planned. The visual effect was essentially the same, a substantial concrete boundary that clearly delineated my property. Throughout the day, a steady stream of cars drove slowly past my house, neighbors rubbernecking to see the controversial wall for themselves. Some stopped to ask questions or express support. Others just watched from a distance, perhaps reporting back to Douglas on my progress. By Friday evening, the temporary placement of materials was complete, creating a continuous concrete barrier along my rear property line and halfway down the side boundary. The wall stood exactly 6 feet tall, imposing but not overtly aggressive, with small gaps between blocks that would eventually host climbing plants to soften the overall appearance. That night, I received a formal notice from the Architectural Review Committee, informing me that my application had been denied due to aesthetic incompatibility with neighborhood standards. Attached was a cease and desist order demanding removal of all concrete blocks within 14 days, with fines of $100 per day to be assessed after that deadline. I called Michelle Patel immediately. They rejected it, just as we expected. Time for the next phase. You're sure about this approach? She asked. It's unconventional, to say the least. So is demanding keys to private property, I replied. I've already started the paperwork. The following Monday, I submitted my application for Wildlife Habitat Conservation designation to the County Environmental Office. By Wednesday, they had sent an inspector who seemed genuinely impressed with my plans to transform the concrete barrier into a living wall, supporting native vines, birds, and pollinators. The structure actually creates excellent microhabitats, he noted, examining the gaps between blocks. Eastern bluebirds could nest here, and these spaces are perfect for native mason bees. Douglas was livid when he learned about my environmental gambit. He showed up at my door that evening, face flushed with anger. This is a transparent attempt to circumvent HOA authority, he sputtered. A concrete wall isn't a wildlife habitat. Actually, according to the County Environmental Office, it will be, I replied calmly. The concrete is just the foundation. The habitat will be the native plants growing on it and the wildlife it supports. He left fuming, promising legal consequences. But by the following week, the county had granted preliminary approval to my Wildlife Habitat Conservation designation, which under local ordinance superseded certain HOA restrictions. The transformation began immediately. I planted Virginia creeper, trumpet vine, and native wisteria at the base of the wall. Between my original fence and the new boundary, I created a meadow of native wildflowers and grasses. Bird boxes appeared at strategic intervals. Within a month, the first shoots of green began climbing the concrete. By summer's end, large sections were covered in foliage, softening the industrial appearance while maintaining the clear boundary. Butterflies fluttered among the coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, while bluebirds investigated the nesting boxes. The HOA's lawsuit against me was dismissed when the judge reviewed the county conservation designation. While the board's aesthetic concerns are noted, the ruling stated, the environmental benefits established by the county designation take precedence under state law. The greatest victory came in September, at the annual HOA election. Stephanie Morgan ran for president on a platform of increased transparency and environmental stewardship. She won by a landslide, with Douglas receiving only a handful of votes. Her first official act was to rescind the key requirement policy, replacing it with a voluntary emergency contact system that respected homeowner privacy while addressing legitimate security concerns. My wall, once the neighborhood controversy, became something of a local attraction. School groups visited to learn about native habitats. The county environmental office featured it in their newsletter. Even real estate agents began mentioning proximity to the Rivera Wildlife Corridor as a selling point for nearby homes. 1. Year after the controversy began, Douglas sold his house and moved away. Before leaving, he stopped by my property one last time. He stood silently for a moment, looking at the wall, now almost completely covered in vibrant autumn foliage. "My granddaughter visited last weekend," he finally said. "She loved the butterflies." He extended his hand. "You were right. About the keys, about everything. Good luck with your habitat." As he drove away, I surveyed my creation. Not just concrete, blocks anymore, but a living boundary teeming with birds, insects, and new growth. What had begun as a battle over a gate key had evolved into something I never could have anticipated, a genuine contribution to the neighborhood and environment. That evening, I sat on my back patio, watching hummingbirds dart among the trumpet, vine flowers that now draped over the top of my wall. The gate to my private trail still stood, unlocked but respected, a threshold between spaces that were both protected in different ways. Sometimes the best way to protect what matters isn't with keys and locks, but by building something worth preserving. And sometimes, the most impenetrable barrier isn't made of concrete at all, but of principles, well-applied knowledge, and the quiet persistence of someone who refuses to surrender what's rightfully theirs. If you've enjoyed this story of standing up to unreasonable HOA demands, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more tales of everyday justice and creative problem-solving. Hit that like button if you've ever dealt with overreaching authority figures, and share this video with anyone facing similar battles. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to protecting your property rights. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.